The house was still when it happened. Dawn crept through the curtains, pale and unforgiving, and I sat beside Conrad's bed with his hand resting in mine. It had been strong once, broad and calloused from decades of working with tools and wood. But now it was weightless. He had slipped away quietly, a stroke ending what cancer and years of strain could not take. I pressed his hand to my cheek, whispering his name into the silence, and then reached for the phone. The hardest call of my life was waiting. I dialed Leora, our only daughter. My chest tightened as the line rang. Hello? Her voice was groggy, wrapped in the comfort of sleep. Leora, I began, though my throat nearly closed around the words. Your father passed early this morning. For a heartbeat, there was only air. Then, faint but unmistakable, another voice bled through the receiver. Silas, reschedule it, he muttered, as if a funeral were a meeting on his calendar. Leora shifted. I could hear her cover the phone with her palm, then return with a careful tone. Mom, today is Silas's birthday. We already planned everything. Could you move the funeral to Tuesday? Her words landed sharper than the news I had just delivered. My husband of 47 years lay cold in the next room, and my daughter was negotiating convenience. No, I said, steady, but breaking inside. Your father deserves Monday. There was a pause. I imagined her staring at him, gauging his approval before speaking again. It would just be easier for everyone. He has clients coming, Leora, I cut in, my voice like a snapped board. It is Monday, 11 o'clock. St. Matthew's. Her breath hissed through the line. Irritation more than grief. Fine. Do what you want. The call ended without goodbye. I lowered the phone. The silence of the house rushing back in, the tick of the kitchen clock felt cruel in its steadiness. I turned to Conrad's chair in the corner of the living room, the old recliner where he had read every night. It stood empty, waiting for a man who would never sit there again. I stayed there, staring at that chair, as the morning light spread across the room and the weight of what had just been said settled into my bones, already pulling me toward the day of the funeral that would not hold my daughter's face. The sky opened as if it too was grieving. Rain traced long, thin lines down the church windows while neighbors filed into the pews. Conrad's former students came with their wives, carrying umbrellas still dripping. Women from the library brought casseroles and whispered condolences as they brushed my arm. They all came, faces solemn, voices low, each carrying a memory of the man I had loved for nearly half a century. But the pew I had reserved for family stayed empty. I kept glancing toward the door, though I already knew it was useless. Leora would not appear. Not today. Not for her father. The absence spread across the sanctuary like a shadow, darker than the rain outside. Pastor Marlowe rose and spoke of Conrad's life. He told stories of Conrad teaching shop class, how he'd guide clumsy hands on a saw until wood fit perfectly into place. He spoke of patience, of kindness, of a man who believed every student could learn if someone stood beside them long enough. I bowed my head, clutching a handkerchief, the words cutting deeper with each phrase. As the pastor spoke, my mind slid backward. I saw Conrad in our garage, sleeves rolled, sawdust in his hair. Leora was 10, perched on a stool, watching as he planed cedar into smooth boards. This is your desk, Princess, he had told her, grinning as she touched the polished surface. He worked nights and weekends on that desk, carving tiny drawers, sanding until the grain shone. When it was finished, he carried it into her room like it was treasure. Years later, she abandoned it without thought, leaving it to collect dust when she moved to Omaha. I had run my fingers across its top just yesterday, the cedar smell faint but still there. The desk was proof of Conrad's devotion, and her silence was proof of how little it meant to her now. As the choir sang and the rain continued, my grief hardened into something else. Leora had not simply missed a funeral. She had chosen convenience over legacy, her husband's birthday over her father's final honor. And that truth lodged in me like a nail that could not be pulled. When the last casserole dish had been collected and the front door finally closed behind the neighbors, silence pressed down on the house. It was not the peaceful kind of silence Conrad and I once shared on evenings by the river. It was hollow, echoing off the walls like a house emptied of its meaning. I wandered into his workshop, a space that still carried his breath. His glasses sat on the bench, folded neatly beside a row of chisels. The birdhouse he had been shaping before the stroke remained unfinished. A square of cedar with one round hole cut into it, waiting for his hands to guide it into something whole. I ran my fingers along the edge, rough under my touch, and the ache inside me deepened. The phone rang in the kitchen. I hurried to answer, heart foolishly hoping, but it was only a voicemail notification. Leora's voice floated through the speaker when I pressed play. Sorry, I couldn't be there. Mom, I'll bring flowers soon. Her tone was light, almost polite, as if she were declining an invitation rather than excusing her absence at her father's funeral. I replayed it twice, listening for grief, for hesitation, for anything real. All I heard was duty spoken without heart. Later that night, unable to sleep, I opened the cedar desk Conrad had built for her years ago. Dust gathered in the corners, but the drawers still slid easily in the shallow middle drawer. Tucked beneath an old envelope of photographs, I found a folded slip of paper in his handwriting. Just 4 words. Guard the life you built. I held it to my chest, trembling. He had known, somehow, that I would need reminding. Conrad had spent a lifetime crafting, repairing, building homes, desks, birdhouses, a family, and now that task had fallen to me. The apology I longed for from our daughter might never come, but the legacy of what Conrad built was still here, waiting to be guarded. I straightened the note carefully on the desk, already knowing the next step would not be waiting, but deciding how to act. 2 mornings after the funeral, I drove into town with Conrad's note folded carefully in my purse. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets washed clean, but nothing could wash away the heaviness pressing on me. I parked in front of the brick office where Cassian Meyer practiced law. He had been our counsel for years, a steady man with round glasses and a manner that reminded me of Conrad's patience. Cassian rose when I entered. Damaris, he said softly, I'm so sorry for your loss. His kindness almost undid me, but I steadied my voice. I didn't come for condolences. I told him. I came for clarity. We sat across from each other at his mahogany desk, the drawers neatly stacked with files. I pulled 2 documents from my purse and slid them across. His brow furrowed as he examined them. The first was the deed to the Riverside duplex, the very building Silas had turned into his showpiece office, plastered with glossy signage. He had no idea that I had bought the property under my maiden name years ago, a quiet investment Conrad and I made after selling a rental cabin. The second paper was a yellowed demand note. 10 years ago, Silas had needed capital to buy into his firm. Conrad had insisted we help, though I had insisted we put it in writing. Silas signed without hesitation, then behaved as if the debt had melted with time. I had never called it in, until now. Cassian adjusted his glasses. This changes everything. You're not powerless. Damaris, you hold leverage he doesn't suspect. I don't want revenge, I said. I want respect for Conrad's memory. I want our life's work guarded. He leaned forward. Then let's change your will. Half to the causes Conrad loved, the literacy fund, the cancer foundation, the animal shelter. The rest, we can make conditional, tied to behavior or service. I thought of Leora's careless voicemail. Not yet, I said firmly. For now, she gets nothing until she shows she understands what legacy means. I can't entrust her with it. Cassian nodded, opening a drawer and pulling out a fresh folder. Then we'll begin here. I left the office lighter than I'd felt in weeks, ready for the letter that would soon land in my daughter's hands. Cassian moved quickly. Within a week, the notices were prepared and mailed repayment of the forgotten demand note, an adjustment of rent for the Riverside duplex, and a draft of my newly written will. I signed each document with a steady hand, Conrad's words echoing in my mind, "Guard the life you built." Then I waited. It took nearly 3 weeks for the silence to crack. On a Friday evening, as I sat knitting by the window, I imagined the scene as clearly as if I'd been there. Silas and Leora, hosting one of their cocktail dinners in Omaha, crystal glasses clinking, guests murmuring about investments, the smell of catered hors d'oeuvres drifting through a rented space that cost more in a night than Conrad and I ever spent in a month. I could almost see the moment the envelope was delivered cream-colored, legal weight. Cassian's firm stamped in the corner, Leora's manicured fingers breaking the seal, her face paling as she read the words that turned her world. Demands for money, rent recalculated, a will that named charities instead of her. Around her, guests whispering, eyes widening, murmurs turning sharp. Silas trying to keep his mask of confidence intact while the floor shifted beneath him. That night, well past midnight, I heard tires on gravel outside my house. Headlights cut across the porch, then a car door slammed, heels striking fast on the walkway. A sharp pounding rattled my front door. "Mom?" Leora's voice was shrill, almost unrecognizable. "Open this door right now," I stood slowly, heart steady, and opened it. She stood there in an expensive dress, hair wild from the wind, mascara smudged, the letter crushed in her hand like a weapon. Her eyes burned into mine as she shoved the paper toward me. "Explain yourself. I didn't want the neighbors to hear us screaming on the porch." So I stepped aside and motioned her in. Without a word, I led her through the kitchen and into Conrad's old workshop. The air still carried the faint smell of cedar, the dust of a life spent shaping wood. His chisels lined the bench like soldiers. The half-finished birdhouse sat where he'd left it. It felt fitting that this be the place where truth was measured. Leora threw the crumpled letter onto the workbench. "You blindsided us. At Dad's funeral, at least I had an excuse. An excuse." My voice was sharper than I intended. "Is that what you call it?" Her chin trembled, though her words came rehearsed. "It was one mistake. Mom, one day. You don't erase a lifetime because of that." I stepped closer, placing my hand on Conrad's old vice, grounding myself. "One mistake." My voice grew low, steady. "Your father lay dying for months, and you came twice. You chose Silas's birthday over your father's funeral, and now you stand here asking me to treat it like a missed luncheon." She blinked, tears welling but not falling. "You don't understand. Silas's clients were there. It would have been humiliating I cut her off. If I died tomorrow, and Silas had clients at noon, would you come to my funeral?" The question hung between us like a weight. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked away. Silence filled the room, thicker than sawdust. Her inability to answer told me more than any excuse could. My chest ached, but the clarity was undeniable. I drew a deep breath. "Until you prove, in action, that respect means more to you than convenience. You are not my daughter. You are the tenant of your own choices. Do not confuse blood with belonging." Her face twisted as if struck, but she said nothing. She only gathered her coat and left the workshop without meeting my eyes. When the door slammed behind her, the cedar scent seemed sharper, almost cutting. I stood in Conrad's workshop alone, knowing the silence had spoken louder than her voice ever could. News travels fast in a town like ours, and faster still in financial circles, within days of Cassian mailing the notices. Silas's firm began to wobble. I heard it from an old acquaintance who still banked with them liquidity problems. Quiet meetings behind closed doors. Partners whispering about gaps in the books. The demand note I had pulled from my purse all those weeks ago was no longer forgotten. It was a stone dropped into their shallow waters, ripples hitting every edge. Still, Silas tried to keep appearances. That summer, he insisted on celebrating his birthday, though the lavish dinners of years past shrank into something smaller. The rented ballroom was gone, instead. A few dozen clients and friends gathered in their Omaha house, sipping champagne from borrowed flutes. I wasn't there, but word reached me through the grapevine. People saw Leora's hands tremble as she poured wine. Guests leaned close, gossiping about the letter from my lawyer, about the will that had left her with nothing. No amount of expensive perfume could mask the scent of humiliation. Later that night, while the city lights dimmed and the music faded, Leora slipped away. I knew because Juniper Ahn, my neighbor, told me she had seen a figure at the cemetery. Juniper had gone to lay flowers for her late husband and found my daughter kneeling at Conrad's grave. Raincoat wrapped tight. A single lily pressed against the headstone. "Forgive me," Leora whispered, her voice carried by the wind across the stones. Juniper didn't approach her. She only watched from a distance, the way women who've lived long enough know when silence speaks louder than company. She told me the next morning, her tone careful, as if not wanting to sway my judgment. I pictured my daughter there in the dark, speaking to the father she had refused to honor in life, and wondered whether the words had been meant for him, for me, or just for her own uneasy conscience. It was a gray Tuesday when I heard the knock. I half expected Silas's polished voice to follow, but when I opened the door, Leora stood there alone, no chauffeur idling at the curb, no husband's shadow lurking behind her, just my daughter, hair pulled back, eyes ringed from sleeplessness. "Mom," she said quietly, "may I come in?" We sat at the kitchen table, Conrad's chair still empty, the silence thick around us. She didn't start with excuses this time. She began with dates. The autumn she skipped Thanksgiving because Silas had a retreat in Denver. The spring she didn't visit when Conrad had been admitted overnight for tests. The day of the funeral, when she chose a cake over a coffin. Each moment laid out like stones, heavy and undeniable. "I was wrong," she said finally, voice breaking, not once, over and over. I listened, my hands folded tight in my lap, feeling Conrad's note in my pocket like a weight. Days later, Juniper stopped by to tell me something unusual. She'd seen Leora at the library, not browsing or chatting, but helping children at the new Makers program, the one founded in Conrad's honor. Pastor Marlowe confirmed it when I asked. Leora had been there 2 afternoons in a row, guiding little hands with tools, telling them stories about her father's patients. I went myself the following week and saw her kneeling beside a boy who couldn't quite manage a clamp. She showed him carefully, her hands steady, her voice softer than I remembered. She looked up and saw me watching, for once. She didn't look away that night. She came by again. I can't erase what I did. She told me, but I can live differently. I can try. I met her eyes, searching for the performance I'd grown used to. Instead, I found something closer to the child who once laughed at sawdust in her hair. Words mean little. Leora, I said, my voice calm but firm. Only time proves truth. She nodded, accepting the sentence. And I knew this story between us was far from finished. Cassian welcomed me back into his office with the same steady patience he'd always shown. Though this time, I sensed he understood I had not come to waver. I laid Conrad's note on the desk between us. I want to honor him, I said, but I also want to test her. He leaned forward. Pen ready, then let's build a will that does both. We worked line by line. Carefully, half of my estate our home. Our savings would go directly to the causes Conrad cherished: the Literacy Fund, the Cancer Foundation, the Shelter for Strays. The other half would be offered to Leora. But only after 1 full year of documented service at the library's Makers Program and the Shop Class Fund named for her father. And it must be hers alone, I added firmly. Silas cannot touch it, not 1 cent. Cassian nodded. We'll stipulate it as separate property, immune to marital claims. Ironclad. When the draft was complete, I felt both drained and strangely lighter. I took out a sheet of stationery and wrote the only letter that mattered. You inherit not money, but our standard. Only if you live by it will the rest follow. A week later, I gave Leora the envelope myself. She opened it with trembling hands in my kitchen. Reading every word, her eyes filled quickly, but she didn't argue. She didn't beg. She only whispered, "A year, then maybe you'll believe me." I don't need to believe you, I said softly. I need to see you. She folded the letter, pressing it to her chest as though it might steady her heartbeat. For the first time in years, I saw determination instead of excuses on her face. It was not redemption. Not yet, but it was something that looked like a beginning, and I held my breath to see where it might lead. A year can weather a soul the way seasons weather wood. By the next spring, the tulips Conrad planted had returned in stubborn color, and with them, a daughter I barely recognized. Leora had divorced Silas, surrendering the gloss of luxury for a modest apartment on the edge of town. She didn't complain. Instead, she showed up every week at the library, every Saturday in the workshop, guiding teenagers as they sanded crooked boards into something smooth. I often watched from the doorway, saying nothing. She laughed again, not the brittle laugh I'd grown used to, but the real one, the one that once spilled across our kitchen when Conrad sprinkled sawdust in her hair. I saw her kneel beside a boy struggling with a hammer, telling him, "My dad used to say every mistake can be fixed with patience." The boy grinned, and for a moment, so did I. One evening, after the last student had left and the lights were low, I sat at Cassian's desk again. The conditional will had served its purpose. Leora had met the terms, not by dragging herself through them, but by living them. She was not perfect, but she was different. I asked Cassian to draw up one final version, half still for the charities Conrad and I loved, the other half restored to our daughter. Recognition of change, but a reminder that legacy must reach further than family, at home. I opened the folder and slipped Conrad's note into the envelope. Guard the life you built. His handwriting was steady, certain, as if he had known all along this would be my compass. Standing in the quiet of our kitchen, I touched the wood grain of the table we'd eaten at for decades. Love had raised this house, brick by brick, year by year, but only honor hard-earned, fought for, and proven kept its door on its hinges. If your child finally came home, would you open the door or hand them the key and wait to see what they build?